Hello, this is Tony Young. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us here with RISE San Diego. RISE is an organization that focuses on urban leadership. We work with the urban communities and develop leaders, but we also focus on civic engagement. And with the RISE Now event today, we're going to do just that. We're going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on education. And with that, there are a number of different issues, and we have an excellent panel here to discuss those issues. As we move forward, we want to make sure that we have a lively conversation and we are able to provide as much insight on this issue as possible. We have a number of panelists, Ronald Preston Clark, who is a RISE Fellow and also works in Chicago at the Urban Prep Charter Academy for Young Men. Courtney Ochi, who is the Dean of Students at the Elevate School here in San Diego. Damon Carson, the National Head, Chair of the National Head Start Program, and also the Vice President at the Neighborhood House Association of San Diego. And we also have Salina Villegas, who is a local leader here, a mother of two, a graduate student, and is dealing with all the issues at her home in regards to focusing on teaching her kids and doing all the work that she does at RISE San Diego. And of course, we have Dr. Fabiola Bagula, who works at the San Diego County of Education office, and she leads some of the effort on how we're going to actually reopen the schools here in the County of San Diego. So we have a broad selection of folks, and then of course, Dr. Zachary Green, who is the lead here at RISE San Diego as an educator, for our leadership program. He'll be moderating our program, and we'll be talking about all of these issues based on his direction. So thank you for being a part of this, and we appreciate you being here today.
Hello, and welcome to this webinar. We will be looking at the issues of education, and we're going to be looking at it primarily from the urban perspective, but indeed this issue of education and its impact in terms of this pandemic is very powerful and being experienced in a number of ways. As is our ought in this kind of webinar, there are going to be two aspects of it. First part of it is we're going to elicit from you some sense of where you think the issues are. We're going to, in a moment, put up a poll, and that'll give you an opportunity to participate, to let us know whether we've hit the issues that you think are important. From that, then we will turn to the panelists. Each will do a 1 minute sort of an introduction of the kinds of issues that they're seeing. And we have a beautiful opportunity because we have every age developmental part of the spectrum present. So we'll be able to weave together a story of what's going on from when a child enters school, let's say through a Head Start program, all the way to what it's like to be thinking about going on to graduate school. And then in between, the kinds of realities that we're facing, especially in the urban communities around that. So in a moment, we're going to find out from you. And also, as always, the chat function is going to be available. So if there's something that you're thinking about that you have a comment on, please put it in the chat. In addition to that, if you have a specific question, there's a question button at the bottom of your screen. And then also feel free to add a question, and we will try to weave those in as we go forward. There will be a specific question part, but given how these tend to flow, we would love to see those early on, and I will try to weave them in as we continue. So from that, what we're going to do is we're going to have a poll to find out where you see the issues. So if we can begin to get that poll, if it can come up, and then we can find out where you stand. In terms of your perception of the needs of the education in our San Diego urban communities, which of the following do you believe are most important to address? And here it is that you have in front of you. Feel free to vote. You have about 1.5 minutes to do so. take another 30 seconds to fill out the survey. Okay, let's see our results. So what we're seeing here is that there are two areas: the ever-present challenge of balancing work and family in a society with no mandatory family or sick leave, along with unequal access to technology, hardware, and software, especially for students with disabilities. So those two issues are at hand, but we also see that the remote teaching issues and the resources for students around their engagement and motivation is key. And then the supplemental meals aspect of this is also something that we want to address. So what is really important here is that at least some of you see that these issues are at hand. And with that, we will begin to work with our panelists, and we will go from there. So we're going to do this developmentally, and each of you, I would like you to sort of speak to the heart of the issue in terms of education in the urban community from your perspective. We'll start with Damon Carson from Neighborhood House in the National Head Start. What are you seeing? You're on mute. Thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. But thank you for the opportunity to be here with you this evening. Certainly am appreciative of Tony Young and his invitation to participate because it is a critical time for us. And just to give a little background information on myself, I believe I'm here to serve two roles in the aspect of early childhood education. One, I am a practitioner. I am a provider for the Neighborhood House Association here in San Diego. We run early childhood services for ages 0 to 5. We serve about 8,000 children a year. Most of our children, the vast majority of our children, come from communities of color. They're our most vulnerable population. They're the lowest wage earners in our community. And to have to close our doors to 8,000 families on March 13th was a big shift for us. On the flip side, you know, as the national president of the National Head Start Association, the vast majority of our 1 million children throughout the country are without service right now. And really the demographics they mirror from city to city, state to state. There's a significant gap right now in terms of services being provided to our most vulnerable population. It's been very challenging, really, to be able to not only connect with our children and families, but to protect our workforce and to make sure our workforce is well taken care of throughout this crisis. We came into this situation really wanting to do three things: connect with our workforce, make sure our workforce were in a position where they could be able to take care of their own families. We wanted to make sure our clients, our children and families, had resources to get them through, and we can certainly go into that later. But what we're really seeing now is a lot of fear of the unknown of when we're going to be able to resume services. In the early childhood education space, there has been a debate that has gone on for at least the last 3 years. And it's been throughout the media. There's been commercials about it, about how much you should expose children under the age of 5 to screen time. And there was recommendations on limiting screen time to 15 minutes or less a couple of times a week. Well, in this new normal that we're in, we're relying upon screen time to connect, communicate, and educate. So one of the things we're seeing is trying to really find the balance with that to minimize screen time and prioritize some of the other important factors like social emotional development. And so balancing that in our new normal has been a challenge. The third piece I would mention is really once we return to normal operations, is really having the resources necessary to meet the regulatory requirements of our new environment, whether it's space, group sizes, hours of operation, things like that concern us at this time.
Thank you very much. That gives us a really comprehensive picture of the kinds of challenges that we have at the early part of our educational spectrum. But then Courtney Ochi, you're dean of an elementary school. What are we finding out there?
Hi, Dr. Green. Thank you again for having me on tonight. I see really similar things that Damon mentioned, in that our kids are really longing for connection. And that's one of the biggest concerns that I have in all of this, is that especially in our elementary age, our kids are coming to school, and I say that they're learning to learn. They're learning not only the academic pieces that we put in front of them, but how to be humans, how to connect with each other. And one of the biggest things we've noticed is that kids are popping onto Zoom just to talk to their teacher and to be able to just talk with friends and whoever they can access, because they're missing that sense of community. And my biggest worry is the trauma that's happening during this time, and how are we going to be able to social emotionally support our students when they come back, and when the teachers themselves have also experienced part of this trauma as well. And how are we able to do that without being able to use that same proximity that we used to be able to use when we were working together?
Thank you very much. And then if we go on to past middle school up to the high school, Ronald Clark, what are the kinds of things that you're seeing at Urban Prep?
Thank you first and foremost, Dr. Green, for having me. One of the major things I'm witnessing is our students have lost their place of comfort. Our students, I have students who will show up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Our school doesn't start till 8:30. We get out at 3:45 and they don't leave till 6. So you're talking about a space that they spend the majority of their time because they feel most comfortable there. And so when you eliminate that from their day-to-day and eliminate the opportunity for them to feel as comfortable as possible, losing those 2 meals each day, losing the opportunity to be around their friends, it's really having a social emotional impact on them. And when you take that away from them, now they're free to be susceptible to some of the elements of our society. And when you have I'm at a school with all Black males, and they really feed off of the energy and the mentorship and the ability to be in contact with their teachers. And when you take that away, now they're at their own whim, and we're losing opportunities for some of our best students who were doing so well after school. But now that it's the students who have the technology are at an advantage now. One of my best students has no internet and has no computer at his house. And so now he's scrambling to get in contact with his teachers in order to get work done. And so we literally have now put disadvantages on our students that were not there previously, and then telling them to adjust. And so it's difficult both on our end as well as on the students. We're adjusting at the highest level we possibly can. But I honestly feel for our students right now, because we're asking them to do something that they've never been asked to do, and still asking them to try to do it at a high level. So we have to be very cognizant and aware of how we are treating our kids right now, and our expectation of our kids right now. And just the fact that they're even checking in through our technology means is a beautiful thing in and of itself. So just knowing that they're still safe, knowing that they're still available, and then moving forward from there.
Thank you, Ronald. And before we get the perspective from policy and how those kinds of considerations are going forward, Salina, you have a unique perspective because you're both a parent and you're a student in higher education.
Yes. So I'm struggling as a parent who is not only working and creating a lot of curriculum for high school students. So I'm on that front. I'm also on the front of really not having anything virtually available for my pre-K student, as he is not, for whatever reason, like deemed he just wasn't a part of the access to laptops or access to distance learning. Now, as a grad school student, I just want to share that, like, grad school students, they struggle in the best of times. And so we are in the worst of times. And so what I'm finding is, at least at the grad school level, a lot of professors are lenient and they're extending the deadlines. However, it seems to be besides the point. Like, I don't really have enthusiasm to write my capstone if I'm focused on the social and emotional learning of my 4-year-old, my 2-year-old, as well as trying to meet the deadlines of my work, the curriculum, the pace, and the quality of education and the curriculum that is being asked of us too at such a fast level it's a lot to deal with. So I'll just say that it's a lot. It's a lot.
Well, thank you. And I can begin to hear some of the emotion behind that as well. And I really hope that we can tap into some of that as we go forward. And Dr. Bagula, there's some things that you're seeing from the county level. Could you just give us sort of a snapshot of the overview, and we'll go into more detail later?
Yes, so a part of the county is to, of course, connect California Department of Ed and the decisions that are being made in Sacramento, and then support our local districts in implementing those. Now, what I've seen is a lot of flexibility and nimbleness of districts openly and clearly trying to address all of the immediate needs. First of all, I saw basic needs by starting to opening up their pantries and thinking about how they were going to feed students. So I was really happy to see that that kept growing day by day, depending on the district. They also kind of went all into making sure that children had devices, had Wi-Fi hotspots. Now, I'm going to say that each district has been different in their pursuit to ensure that all of the children had these basic tools, but I know of several districts that are actually creating packets every 2 weeks and delivering them to students as well. So there are a lot of different things that districts are doing, but that's actually one of my concerns. My concerns is the variability in the system, because that is actually exacerbating all of the inequities that exist for our students. I'm really concerned about the social emotional piece that Courtney referred to as well. I think we're going through global trauma that we're not addressing yet. So I'm going to say yet because we're still trying to think about how we're going to address it as we re-engage into society. So that's actually what the county has been doing. We're currently in design stage of how to re-engage and reopen schools and make them the healthiest we possibly can for students, but also thinking about what is it going to look like to actually welcome students back and then accelerate the learning gap that we know is happening right now.
Thank you very much for that intro, because one of the concerns I'm finding that I'm having is that there is something that's going to happen in terms of equity and achievement as we go forward. So I'm going to start with you again, Mr. Carson. What are the kinds of things that we know from the Head Start perspective that this program provides in the first place, and what are the concerns that you have going forward because of that?
I really believe that Head Start is really the nation's laboratory for early learning and being able to demonstrate the importance of opportunities to attend a high quality early childhood program where children can have, I guess the theme has been early in this conversation, opportunities to socially and emotionally develop from a very young age. I think the second piece that is critical to this, in the Head Start model, we really emphasize that the parent is the primary educator, the first and the primary educator of the child throughout their life. It gets difficult when you have to kind of change your model on such short notice, where you have very limited opportunities for group settings, opportunities for social emotional development, technology gaps where parents can't necessarily embrace the role as the primary educator of their child because they don't know what to do. These are things that really concern us. Once we are able to resume, how we get back to our normalcy around the foundations of our program really concerns us.
And is that the same kind of thing that you're trying to speak to Ronald Clark when you're saying that there are really some gaps that you're seeing with your students there?
Yes, it's really sad because as a teacher who teaches from a space of empathy and a space of love and a space of social emotional learning, when you are placed into these spaces where I'm now only seeing my kids 3 hours a week. I only have a class on Tuesday for an hour and a half and for Friday for an hour and a half. And when you want to still teach the academic piece, but you're so much more concerned now with how they are feeling as people and how they are doing as individuals. And I'm always asking about their families. And we have, as educators, we have to adjust to this climate and adjust how we teach. And what's happening is a lot of the younger teachers, honestly, are more well equipped at this point to be successful in this space because technology is such a major part of our lives already. We're having to teach a lot of our veteran teachers how to be able to take the comfort level that they have in the classroom into a online space. And so you really are concerned with how students are, because students are giving up quicker. And because we're not there to actually put our hand on their shoulder and tell them that they're okay, we've lost a lot of our ability to be that foundational piece for our students. And we have to be able to learn how to navigate within this new space.
And is that the same thing, Courtney Ochi, that you're seeing? Because prior to being at Elevate, you're also at an urban school that focused on social emotional learning. So what are the kinds of concerns that you have around those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with all the things that have been said. I think that, you know, one of the comments that was made was around like access to technology, right? And we can give our kids technology or we can give them the pieces that they need. There's been, you know, the distribution and all of those pieces. But what we do see is the inequity between the kids who have always had technology in their home and are really well versed at using it and know exactly how to jump into all these pieces at 5 years old to 12 years old, with kids that are learning this for the first time and that are also trying to manage siblings that they're supporting, as well as families who have a difficulty accessing the technology with them, along with language that makes it an additional barrier to trying to access what the school is providing. So I think there's all those pieces that are all like a link into this. And I agree with this theme of social emotional learning because I think that impacts you. That impacts you when you realize that your background doesn't look the same as somebody else's Zoom background when you're going in there, or that your internet's choppy in and out and not allowing you that same access to conversation with other kids. And I think those are all pieces that actually impact the student emotionally and how they're feeling when they're going to these classes and these sessions.
So that helps me understand that not only are we dealing with just the access issues, that there are also aspects that you as educators are beginning to feel in terms of that social emotional support, starting in Head Start, going into the elementary school space, going into the high school space. But Dr. Bagula, we already knew that there were equity issues. You're the director of equity for the county office. And so there were already equity issues and achievement issues that we were running into at schools. What do you think are the implications of this pandemic on the academic achievement gaps that we're already seeing?
It's already exacerbating those gaps. I keep calling it, you know, almost like a Grand Canyon. It's really apparent at this moment. And I kept thinking, I was hearing Courtney describe, you know, her work at her school. And I know one of the things that we did when we were looking at the design implementation of these virtual learning spaces, the two questions that we were really pushing into district leaders as they kind of were creating this was, how is your own bias about distance learning emerging and what you're leading? And how is your own privilege putting up blind spots for you when you're designing? Because we, Courtney just described.
You're saying that there are blind spots that you're seeing in the teachers around online learning?
Yes, because we're seeing it out of our own privilege or our own bias. So we either don't like this distance learning piece, and so we're already kind of going at it from this learning piece of, I'm not sure I'm going to like it. I can't reach all students. It's a lot less. And so though that's going to have some manifestations. The other piece is that I have my own privilege around my computer system. So does my son, so does my husband. But if I were still a 7-year-old, I would be in a room with all of my cousins and my siblings all trying to do distance learning at the same time. So I can connect to prior me, but some people don't have that experience. And so we assume, right, because that's how our brain functions, it takes shortcuts like that. We're going to make some assumptions that most of we have similar backgrounds and we can all do this work. And so I'm trying to give as much grace on this because we are all in a global pandemic. And so we're not in our best self right now. We're actually, I keep saying this is fertile ground for implicit bias, microaggressions, for everything to happen right now because our brain is scared and it's in urgent mode. And so our brain is making those really quick decisions. And what's happening is all of these little things are starting to emerge. So beyond getting a Wi-Fi device, beyond getting a laptop, there's issues of quality. There's issues of what if a child can't read and now you're assigning reading for 3 days because you're not seeing him for 2 days. So little things like that, parents that don't speak English, much like Courtney described. So we're also trying to guide districts into doing different things. For example, I know that there's 3 pieces that went out. One of them was, can we provide a space to have some sort of virtual play for students and connect them with peers? Can we provide a parent support group? If we have this homework packet that we don't understand, how might we teach parents how to help guide them? And then lastly, because now that parents are with their children alone, at home, hopefully if they're not essential workers, which is a whole other category, is can we then have a 15-minute weekly sort of check-in to see, oh, I've noticed now that my child flips the B's and the D's. Can I have a discussion about what I can do? So there's some other little things that we can connect and continue to really strengthen our relationship across, but all of those things are just emerging because we didn't pay attention to them and because we were all in urgent design mode. So I'm not going to fault anyone. It was just like the pandemic happened.
So the pandemic, you're saying, has an overlay of complexity around these different kinds of issues that are all coming together. And what we're seeing here in terms of the questions that we're receiving is that there are issues around the special education. There are also issues around connectivity. And there are also issues around when are we even going to be able to have that sort of opportunity to really be back, because the physical distancing will no doubt still be in place for quite some time, even when we are able to return. So have any of you given some thought to that? And Salina, I want to start with you, because you're designing curriculum for your kids. You're also working with high school students that you are supporting around these social, emotional, developmental leadership capacities. And then now that kind of work is not possible, and curriculum, you're filling in gaps that you would hope that the district would provide, and that's not there. How are you responding to that?
I think that the way that I'm responding to it is making sure that everybody in my circle, whether it's my my family or it's my my boss or my professors or even my children, that the achievement gap that we're seeing is a product of our unequal society, not necessarily all on education. So I did want to allude to what was mentioned earlier about education has been, there's kind of a lot, we've been putting a lot of our eggs in one basket by depending on education to kind of fulfill to fulfill the debt that has already existed historically, economically, at the social political level. And so I think that there is, the way that I'm surviving is by making it a collective obligation, that I don't really want to restore the status quo, because the status quo wasn't all operating at the effective level, obviously, and it wasn't serving all of us. And so when you're a parent and you're working, we need our employers to understand that we have lives outside of the deadlines that you give us. When you're a student as well, undergraduate, graduate, or in the K through 12 level, we have things going on outside. And so I think that we need to look holistically at the entirety of not just the children's lives, but educators' lives and the parents' lives, because we're all struggling to show up. We're struggling to show up to learn, and that's because there are just some very basic needs that are not being met.
Thank you for that. Before I return to Damon, Carson, and ask some more questions about the early childhood implications of this, I would like to get a real view into what it's like in the classroom, or the so-called classroom right now. And so Courtney, Ochi, and Ronald Clark, I'd like you both to speak to that, because your home is now also the classroom, and the home of these children, that's also the classroom. So this glimpse into this life is different right now. Ronald Clark, you spoke to one of your best students to not have reliable internet, and therefore it's affecting his achievement. And Courtney, you talked about that there are going to be parents who, because of the language gaps, are going to run into issues in terms of supporting their children and being able to provide them that extra help. What are the kinds of things that you're seeing as you look into these homes and as they look back at you? Ronald, you want to start?
It's you're getting to know your students at a different level, because now when you ask them a question, you get to hear the background noise in their home. You get to hear how many siblings they have. You get to hear if their mom is home or if their mom is not. You get to hear their responsibilities. I had 32 kids in my virtual classroom on Tuesday, and the majority, and they know to be on mute unless they have to speak. You can't mute a kid in real life. And so it's this really different, this really different dynamic, because now as an educator, I feel like I have more control of the surroundings of the education, but you recognize that it's so much more than that, because when you're in person, you get to feel the energy, you get to see the facial expressions, you get to recognize what happened to that child prior to arriving to your school. I only feel like I'm able to handle my class right now because we've already built the rapport we built in person throughout the school year. It's one of the reasons why I'm very concerned with hearing that we might possibly be doing e-learning in the fall, because as a teacher, I'm gonna have new students. Trying to create that community, trying to create that love, and trying to create that rapport in an online setting with young people, and they don't know you yet. They don't really know you because you're not in person. To be able to create those type of classroom settings, and it's going to be difficult for a lot of us. And when you are trying to build intrinsic motivation, which I'm learning is we were providing ourselves as teachers. We were providing their motivation. Students are asking, are these assignments being graded? Because if they're not, I don't want to do it. And I can't really get mad at them. So how do we present a classroom setting from our homes that is dynamic enough to where students who are not in it for a grade will still join us, will still be willing to put forth the work? And you're recognizing just how many students are truly in it for the education and not for the grades. And I've always had an issue within our education system on how much we put grades at a premium instead of learning at a premium. And you're starting to see that transpire now, because now that when you take that grade component out of the space, now students don't have the motivation to even complete the work. And so it's quite an adjustment. I try to make sure that my background is clear and blank, and try to have it as much of an education kind of setting as possible. But I mean, there's just certain hurdles that we can't get over, but we try our best.
Thank you. And Courtney, what are you saying when
So
you look into these, these homes?
The funny thing about the elementary setting is that grades aren't necessarily always the motivator there, right? But it's the people. And so we find that for our kids, they're most motivated if they know that they're going to have one-on-one time with their teacher, or for our students in special education, if they're able to connect with the one-on-one that they had previously, or the classroom aid, that's what's motivating them, and that's what's getting them excited to learn. What's really interesting is that when we were in the school setting, for some kids who have a lot of like sensory overload when they're in a classroom, or when some of those factors like being at home has actually helped. Whereas for other kids who are really seeking that attention at school, it's like, it's getting bigger and a bigger issue at home without that that constant feedback from the teacher, from other students. And so we're seeing what we saw in school be different for kids at home, which is interesting because the settings change, right? The behavioral needs, those social emotional needs are changing as we see them at home. And so one of the things that we've had to really shift is, well, how are we utilizing our people to incentivize our kids to want to be there and feel connected and feel inspired? And for some of our kids, it's just having their one-on-one join in with a small group and then having them go into a breakout session after, so that they can spend 5 extra minutes like playing hangman via annotations on Zoom together, or getting to like watch a fun YouTube video together. It's having to really shift and utilize those. We're depending on those relationships, and we're able to do that because we're in the end of the school year. But like Ronald said, I don't know what that would have been like had this happened at the beginning of the school year, when that's the part of the school year where we're working on those relationships.
Thank you so much for that. So that means that the social emotional learning and these achievement gaps are beginning right at the beginning where you work, Damon, Carson. So how does all this come together? What are you seeing? And can you give us some sense of what it's also like for your educators as they are facing this pandemic?
Well, I think, in trying not to be repetitive, but the panelists have done a great job in describing what our teachers are really going through, and in trying to shift from a environment where there's a great deal of interactions that occur each and every day to an environment where you're forced to, periodically communicate with your students. And the sad thing about it, those relationships are really formed in the early years, in our early childhood space. And children really depend on these relationships that they have with their teachers. And so I've heard from both teachers as well as parents that there is a gap there. Teachers are truly missing their students, but students, more importantly, are missing their teachers and the interactions that they have. As simple as greeting them in the morning, saying, "How are you feeling today?" Sitting down and eating a meal family style with their teachers. And so there's a certain amount of trauma that comes with that, as we all know. Again, it's a difficult balance. Wanted to just, pivot and address one of the questions that was posed to me in the chat room. And it may sound, for those that have seen the question, it's a very insightful question for a couple of different reasons. We know when we resume services, when we open back up our schools, what we're hearing is there's going to be many restrictions on physical spacing requirements, the number of children you can have in one setting, and the question was really, will all the children be able to come back to their original classroom setting or program? And that's a very tough question, but my gut tells me is that there's going to be restrictions in the sense of how many children you can have in a classroom. Normally 24 children are in our classroom with 3 teaching staff. And I don't see an environment once we phase back into normal services that really could support that many children in one setting. So there's tremendous challenges there. We're trying to help our teachers really get comfortable with this new way of communicating with children and families. And I think one of the panelists has said earlier, it's a little easier for the younger staff than it is for some of our veteran staff, but we're trying to give support on all levels for our teachers to connect with children and families.
Yes. You're really speaking to one of the complexities that I don't think any of us have fully considered, is that there's a belief that we're going to return to normal, but normal will not look the same. Because indeed, until there is a cure or a vaccine for this, that some of the protocols that are in place will continue to need to be in place. And the whole nature of face-to-face education will shift accordingly. So Dr. Bagula, you were alluding to this when you were speaking before. You were saying that there's an overlay of issues. And before I turn to all of you and ask you, what is that real call to action? If there's one thing that you want them to know, that the people that are with us right now really want them to know about, this is the call to action that we need in terms of education, especially in the urban context, what would that be? But Dr. Bagula, you were trying to speak to an overlay of a number of issues that are going on concurrently. Could you offer that so that we can really see the kinds of things that have to go into the policies that you are making in terms of when these schools might even open again?
So yes, and one of the biggest pieces that we have to really actively start designing, and I'm going to actually say we're in design mode now, is to figure out what's going to be the formative assessments that schools have to put in place in order to see and understand where our families are coming from and what was the true learning loss for each one. We're actually creating a continuum of disruption to gauge and hold empathy interviews with each family to see just how their life was disrupted, and then to try to align services for those specific needs. There's also going to be, because we're not testing, we're not going to have any of the traditional data because education is so different. We're going to have to figure out, come whenever we start school again, is figure out how are we going to accelerate children now that we have them again in order to ensure that they are still at grade level. And so to mitigate the learning loss has really been the big push from the county. So that's really the biggest piece that I can offer, is to start thinking now, how are you going to collect not only data academically, but also how are we going to collect data on, again, that continuum of disruption, and how are we going to help support families based on whatever kind of disruption it was, because we're all experiencing this differently.
And then finally, can you speak to the overlay of issues that you were trying to speak to before? You talked about a collective trauma. What do you mean by that, please?
Well, I'm really concerned because the county has actually a document that has 20 different points for each school district and each school to consider when they reopen. And when I took a look at that document, I kept thinking we're thinking very technical. We're still thinking about the 6-foot distancing, the masks, how many classrooms we open up, how many children are allowed, who's allowed on campus, do we take their temperature, that kind of thing. And I just kept thinking of, we need to change the narrative. I mean, to have a child, especially around elementary school age, enter a school and be afraid to be around their peers or to want to hug their peers, how are we going to discipline that? Like, we can't. We have to take hold of the narrative now and ensure that the narrative is about compassion and love for the safety and the health of fellow man. And right now is the time to do that before the kids come back in, so they don't come back in with fear, so that our teachers, because remember, our teaching force is very different. We have the teacher that might have fear and anxiety around this disease, might have underlying conditions, we might have the teacher that's also protesting their right to get COVID-19. So how they discipline children around social distancing is going to be very different accordingly. So my biggest concern is, how do we narrate this, that it's coming back to school is about our learning. Wearing a mask is about protecting you from me, not me being afraid of you. And then how do we keep our compassion and this humanity instead of being fear-based? And then, of course, I don't want schools to replicate this piece around you broke a rule, you weren't 6 feet away, and so now you're going to get sent to the principal's office. So I really would hope that we don't replicate systems that have been systemically oppressing lots of populations for many years.
Thank you so much. So we're going to pivot to a call to action, but those of you who have been online with us, you probably have lots of thoughts. The chat is open for you to offer any thoughts, reflections. We'll try to fold that in our last 15 minutes here. We invite any of you to offer anything that you may be thinking, any reaction that you have. We may not have enough time for any other questions, but whatever it is that you're thinking about, please offer it in the chat right now. So Salina, you're the person that sort of, I would say you bridge all of these worlds. You're an educator, you're a student, you're a mother. You're trying to develop a curriculum. If there were one thing that you would say to all of us that we really need to take into consideration, because you were beginning to feel into that, and if you could offer us some of the sense of what is it that we really not only need to think about, but feel into as we're going forward, what would that be?
Ooh, yeah. I'm just feeling like we live in an environment that supports individualism, and I would really like for us to reconsider that it takes a community, and it takes more than one person. As some of you all may have heard, like it's a village, and so we have to give each other love. We have to give each other grace, and our children are depending on us for their well-being right now. And so it's there, like I said earlier, there's a collective responsibility for us to take a holistic approach, the way that we look at each other, the way that we treat each other, starting with our children. As parents, we need to give them grace when they don't want to learn. And as an educator, I need to think more inclusively already, and not assuming that my students have a pen and a paper available. And then as a grad student, just asking and wanting for us to, wanting us to love each other.
Thank
is
you.
what I'm asking, yeah.
But your university just announced that it's going to be opening in the fall. So what are you going to do?
Not looking to join them anytime soon. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old that I'm still holding it down for. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ronald Clark, one thing, just one thing you say. If we don't do anything else about urban education right now in this pandemic, the one thing we have to do is first we got to love each other with compassion. That's what we're getting from Salina. What are we going to learn from you, Ronald?
We need to re-engage the school to family relationship and further educate our parents on recognizing that the relying on the school setting as the primary educator has to cease. When you're running into scenarios where it almost feels as if the student is by themselves in the pursuit of their own education and doesn't have that the parental aspect to it, it puts a lot of pressure on the schools, and it puts a lot of pressure on the teachers. But us as teachers need to reach out to those parents and make sure that we're building those relationships so we can create that parent, student, teacher triangle and be able to serve our teachers, our students at the highest level. But on a lighter note, we're finding out that internet access needs to be a right and not something that only the privileged can afford.
You're aligned with two people that just wrote. One person says that AT&T is offering stuff at $10 a month if you never had services before. So they're trying to be responsive. But another person is saying also what you just said, is that we need to co-construct a narrative beginning now that changes the mindset of all of those players so that we begin to reimagine what education can be going forward. And so now I'm going to turn to you, Courtney, Ochi. What do you say? The one thing that you want us to think about would be what?
Mine is that I really hope that we start to reprioritize that social emotional learning again in education. As we saw this year, Fabiola mentioned that CAS testing ended, right? That got canceled. And, but the needs of our students don't get canceled. There needs to, like, the academic learning does need to continue. And I'm not saying we throw that out, but I'm saying that we need to prioritize their emotional well-being the same way that we're prioritizing that academic learning, because our kids are not going to learn in the classroom if they do not feel safe, if they don't feel supported, especially when we return back from this.
Thank you. Because what you're really saying is that there has to be a deep kind of safety. You're not just like safe in terms of like from getting the virus, but you're sort of talking about that emotional safety as well. Am I hearing you?
Yeah, and that comes from well-trained educators who are personally knowing their students, right? And having that deep understanding of who all of our kids are in front of us.
So what we're getting on the chat is that there are different ways that these priorities are understood, and that not everyone is accepting that this is hard and necessary in the same kind of way. So I'm going to read it. Recognizing and accepting that our priorities are not all the same, and that our priorities are not everyone else's. Accepting that it's hard, but it's necessary, is offered by those who are attending to what we're doing right now. So Damon and Carson, we're going to turn to you. This is the one thing that we need to think about in terms of urban education from your perspective.
My call to action is really, one word is to advocate. And we as community, in particular parents, need to become well-skilled in advocacy as it relates to equity and funding, equity to access to high quality education. I've spent the last 5 years, spent a lot of time, more than I should, in Washington, DC, meeting with hundreds of congressional members. And when things get done at the federal level, they usually get done through a couple of different ways, too many to describe on this webinar. But one of the impactful ways is the voice of the client or the end user, and parent testimonials of how high quality education has benefited their children, how high quality education has benefited their family and put them in a stable place to go to work, go to school. Those are things that legislators really want to hear. It sounds old and simple, but I've had many members of Congress tell me letter writing campaigns are still very effective to get the message across in terms of what's needed. So if we're going to advance equity for our communities of color as it relates to the educational spectrum, then we have to engage our parents, we have to engage our community members around advocacy in an organized way.
Thank you very much for that. Because it's not simply about our individual actions, there are also policy level elements of this. And there are a couple of things that are coming in that I want to make sure that I note, is that there are social economic issues that are going into that. And so in North County of this, of San Diego, we're going to have a very different kind of response. And then we also have this possibility of blaming the learner. And so when that kid comes in with their dirty mask or their used mask, then this will be yet another way of creating trauma and stigma. And another voice talks about we're beginning to see the implications of historical trauma. So Dr. Bagula, you get the final word here. What is it that you really see as a call to action that's necessary?
I think right now we have the opportunity to dismantle the systemic oppression that has existed in public education. I think that if we collect the formative data of the communities that we serve around any sort of continuum of disruption or learning gaps, we have the ability to intentionally redesign opportunities and intentionally redesign how we support each other in ensuring that children get the equitable conditions that they need and that they deserve. So my hope would be that we don't come back to school and just do old school with our old schema. I would hope that we come back, that we see just how fragile we really are, and that we design with intention around supporting everybody. And I mean teachers too, not only just students. How might we support all of us to take care of all of us? That's really my call to action, my last piece, that we have an opportunity here for redesign and for dismantling of systems.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists for what you have offered, the range of insights that you are providing, and the depth of feeling that is underneath these words. I appreciate that you gave depth of substance and also really spoke to the challenges of access, of equity, of achievement, of systemic and traumatic elements, the importance of social emotional learning as we go forward in a foundation of compassion and love. If you're looking on this, you will see that there will be nonprofit partnership training through RISE. And then next week at this time, we will be looking at the impact on immigrant communities. We'll turn it back over to Tony Young for the final word. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Green. That was wonderful. We had a number of folks watching. I don't know if you got a chance to see how many participants were here, but it was terrific. And I just want to say thank you to the educators. I mean, clearly, I think now more than ever, we understand how important educators are in our society. And I heard a couple of things that were really interesting. And one of them was that this is an opportunity for us to not only put the spotlight on what is going on in education and some of the many of the deficiencies that are there, but it's an opportunity to also make it better, right? And possibly technology is this use of technology will allow us to maybe move forward in some ways and maybe balance the playing field if we do this right. So I would encourage you all to continue to do the work. I know it's so difficult, but we do appreciate you. And thank you for bringing this to the table and discuss this in front of the people who really want to know about it. And finally, Dr. Green, we think that you're amazing. We appreciate you. You know, we probably don't pay you enough. I don't think we pay you anything for this, but the bottom line is you're terrific, and we want to say thank you for your work. So again, next week we're going to focus on the issues of COVID-19 and the refugee population. And we'll be hopeful to hear and see you all next week. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye now.
There is also a feedback survey if you get a chance to read that up. Thank you, panel.